Hey folks, welcome to today's video. We'll be covering Demonology, again, harking back to the State of Warlocks video if you want to go check that out. We're going to be breaking apart the 17 streets I did, and we're also going to discuss the changes that have happened since the completion of that key in terms of Demonology Warlocks and what that might mean for Prepatch and how we approach Mythic Plus going forward. So strap in, this is going to be an interesting one. So, quick precursor then, as feedback from the Affliction video that you guys have been watching yesterday. This is the build I ran for the 17 streets in question. The class tree, you'll know, I pretty much just constantly run as the same. You could move Inquisitor's Gaze out, maybe go for Fel Synergy, or maybe Teachings of the Black Harvest, but again, we discussed that in the Demonology pre-patch guide itself, so if you want to understand why you have these options, please do go watch that. But the main discrepancies for us within the spec tree that other guides might not necessarily cover or were running at the time, is I was running both Demonic Strength, Felguard, and Fel Might, all to augment Fel Sunder and try and maintain its uptime. Now, on the 2nd of this month, so 2nd of November, here in the EU, or the 1st of November if you're in the US, Demonology got a swath of buffs across the board, really. Implosion, Balscourge Bombers, Hand of Gul'dan, Guillotine's Fel Explosion damage was increased and its radius, Vile Fiend was increased, Grim of Felguard was increased, Anilian Training now further improved, which is the improvement to our Felguard. Wild Imps now have a 15 or 30% chance to become the Imp Gang boss, remembering that Imp Gang boss itself, they do 50% more damage than a regular Imp. As you can see here, it was originally 20%, so Imp Gang bosses are now a huge amount of damage, and when they are imploded, they do more damage, but also when they're imploded or they dissipate on their own, you get an Imp back anyway. Pit Lord from Gul'dan's Ambition, if you're running the Nether Portal build, was also increased, and Demonic Tyrant also got a buff, because unfortunately our Demonic Tyrants are a little bit weak sauce with the loss of Demonic Consumption. And as a result, what this means is there may actually be a variant build that you can now run, but we can discuss that either at the end of this video, or we will discuss it in a update video that I'll do later in the week. But for now, let's get into the actual video itself, talk about it, and actually break it down for you guys. So hopefully you enjoy. So let's get the dungeon rolling. Moving a few spells and abilities around as we start this dungeon, and there's not a lot to say early on. These are relatively small packs. We're not expecting to do a lot of damage. This is, again, predominantly a guild run with Penny, Zero, and Teddy joining us from the guild. And I believe our healer was a pug. Again, still ironing out the UI kinks in this particular dungeon. But you can see that I've kind of reverted back to Elf UI for the most part. Now, one of the things early on, and I have forgotten to do my eye, it's not floating around and my weak aura is trying to remind me. One of the first things to say about the Guillotine Tyrant build is there is a lot to manage, especially with having things like Demonic Strength to maintain, our Soul Strike, which will now cleave as you're running the Guillotine build. But you have so many things to try and monitor and keep on top of that although you kind of have an answer for everything, like you can see here that I'm doing quite reasonable DPS. It's nothing huge and it's not like Soul Shape level or Soulfire levels of disgusting, but then again, we're playing a Streets, we're not playing a Gambit. So the packs aren't as huge, they're more consistent. So Demonology has something for it every time. Like we have Dogs, we have Implosion, we have Soul Strike, we have Demonic Strength, Soul Rogue, Grimoire, and we also have Guillotine as well. But you can see that there's a lot going on in the rotation. So much so that I'm actually missing things. Like, I'm stuck at 5 shards here. I was stuck at 5 shards for a while there as I was trying to rotate things around. And some of this rotation is going to clean up going into Dragonflight itself, because we're going to lose things like Soul Rot. So where Soul Rot at the moment is used on a minute cooldown, it's kind of our AoE pad, it gives us a Decaying Soul Satchel, that is going to essentially have its spot filled up by Guillotine. And Guillotine is going to cause our Felguard essentially to benefit as though it had Decaying Soul Satchel, because it attacks 50% faster while Guillotine's down, and its auto attacks will cleave onto everything around it, while also having the Fel Explosions, and you've got to remember that Guillotine's a 45-second cooldown. So you're going to have it more consistently. But that does require your tank to be a little bit more static in its pull style. For everything else, though, especially with the changes to how Demonic Strength's interacting, and how the damage of like our Felguards being augmented, our Imps, Imp Gang Boss, and things like that, we're looking at having a much more passive and cleaner DPS style going forward, especially if you're learning Demonology. Because, as we say, at the end of the video, if this doesn't take too long, I will talk about a variant build, or I will follow it up in its own video after playtesting the variant build myself, so we have a dungeon to analyze. But you can see that, for the most part, we're looking at just kind of keeping things rolling. I've had this discussion with a couple of other Warlocks, especially one of the Warlocks in our guild, but you have 2 forms of AoE builds that you can play with Demonology. One centers around the use of Implosion, and the other doesn't. The other actually relies on your Felguard and your Dreadstalkers. And comparatively, both AoE profiles work really, really well. We've practiced in raid, especially with the chaotic motes, because as you know, chaotic motes are, from a raiding perspective, a really good example of just like kind of how snap AoE this can be. Implosion is very, very good if you want snap AoE for something, but it comes at the cost of you then having to ramp back up afterwards, because you've basically just yeeted all of your imps into the nether. Whereas the AoE build that revolves around just having your Dreadstalkers means that although you don't have that AoE capacity as often, because you have things like Dreadlash and Call from the Shadows and your Hand of Gul'dan, your imps are still putting out single target damage. Like that's going to happen, but your Dreadstalkers are the brunt of your AoE with your Felguard, which is where you're going to want talents like Felsunder or your Soul Strike, and being able to constantly position well so that your pets are getting the maximum cleave. So it's making sure that you know which target is your priority target to hit to get the most benefit from those AoE abilities. Whereas Implosion's kind of fire forget, and then you have like 9 seconds where you're ramping back up before your next Implosion. Now, that difference in AoE playstyle we can discuss in its own video if that's something you're interested in. If so, please do comment below, and I might try and get the other Warlock Tricky who prefers that playstyle, who doesn't like Implosion. He might be able to better explain it if I can get it in writing from him, if he doesn't fancy, you know, telling me over voice. But we can figure that out when we cross that bridge. As for the rest of how Demonology plays, nothing's really changed. We've talked a lot about how its damage profile itself has changed and how the shift has happened to move us away from Tyrant because of the loss of Decon. And some of the changes and the buffs that we've had to Tyrant, and once we get into Dragonflight with being able to choose Reign of Tyranny as well if we so wish, may mitigate some of that, and our Tyrant may still be a really big part of our damage. But for now, as we have discussed in previous videos as well, Demonology's kind of unfinished. And this is because we are really hampered by those lack of the final 5 talents, as it were. Because we really have to decide, do we want single target? Do we want our Tyrants to generate us shards and do damage? Or do we want to be able to AoE? Because remember, Baseline Tyrant now, once you talent into it, does not generate you shards like it used to. So you don't have that ability to spend all your shards, summon your Tyrant, extend your existing pets out, and then go into spending more shards immediately. Which kind of hurts. There is a build that is available to you if you want to drop Guillotine and pick up 1 point for some shards, which will give you 3 shards, but losing Guillotine really kind of hurts your consistent AoE. Because this is the thing with Demonology, it's not going to be the flashy build like Affliction is. Like, you watched my Affliction video from yesterday, first pack, first big pack in a Gambit, I peak 224k DPS, everything dies, I do like 5 million damage at the end of that pack, nearly 6, and even though Gambit then has a chain essentially of bosses afterwards where there's not a lot of packs in between, I've still done enough DPS that we finished that dungeon at 32k DPS-ish. And the difference is huge. Like, the only reason we were beaten in that dungeon is because our Fire Mage Mellow, really good Fire Mage, has a really good mix of both single target and AoE, whereas for Affliction, again, we kind of have to choose at the moment. And that's probably the story of Warlock, but it's most exemplified through Demonology at the moment. We are the not quite finished build or spec out of the 3 Warlocks, but we're the most consistent. And again, this goes back to the fact that we constantly have stuff for something. Now, my performance in this dungeon isn't a great example of what Demonology is capable of at the moment, because unfortunately with the build I wasn't anticipating there to be so much that I had to manage. And as I said, Guillotine, Soul Rot, Decay, Demonic Strength, you've then got your Soul Strike, making sure your Handical Dans, your Demonic Core procs, your Tyrants out, your Grim of Felguards out, your Trinkets out, you're using pots and potions, you're imploding at the correct time while making sure that you've got enough imps ready to go for the next lot. And then there's also the legendary to consider, because Demonology at the moment during the pre-patch has 2 legendary options essentially that you can play. The reason I say 2 that you can play is because realistically you're going to be taking the Grim Inquisitor's talent that replaces the Grim Inquisitor's legendary. So you're still going to have Dreadstalkers being buffed by how many shards you spend as a effect anyway, which gives you the option for Wilfrids or the Forces of Horn Nightmares, which gives your Hand of Gul'dan a chance to basically be cast a second time for the same amount of shards. It's an RNG legendary, but when you consider that there are going to be builds, especially when we do discuss the variant build itself and the changes to imps, you're going to be pushing it through numbers. Like, you're going to be casting so many Hands of Gul'dan that you're just going to be proccing extra free Hand of Gul'dans and the imps that generate from that. And even in the current state, like if I was playing Horses of Fawn Nightmare here, I'd still get benefit from it. Because the thing is, you have so many different answers to something as Demonology. They might not be the best answers, but they're answers. And because they're all on so many different timings, moving Tyrant down to a minute through Wilfrids, when I don't necessarily have a way to make my Tyrant really hit hard, doesn't bring as much to the party as, say, being able to have more imps, or being able to fully benefit from that kind of damage, whereas Wilfrids will get more benefit if you are running something like Reign of Tyranny. And you are able to fully stack into your Tyrant. Now, this fight was done a little bit of a mess. Like, you can see that I'm having to move in to the melee group because the first person that had it didn't. And there were periods there where I wasn't casting, which really hurt my DPS a little bit. But again, this is kind of where you can see that we don't really have that option in terms of single target, I guess. And there is actually, on the topic of legendaries, there is actually one other legendary that we can play and might be worth playing in non-tyrannical settings, and that would be Implosion. Because remember, if you implode and you hit more than 3 targets, you get a considerable amount of haste. So much so that that haste was actually capped a while back, but you can still get about 75% haste from a good implosion. I think it actually caps out at 75% haste. But either which way, you can get upwards of 30-40% haste per implosion, and then you can maintain it, especially from pack-to-pack pulls. So something like a Gambit, for instance, would be a really good example of you being able to maintain that amount of haste, especially when you consider, like, if you look at how Gambit was pulled in my Affliction video, that pull cadence and the amount of packs we pulled and how often we had something to cleave off, both on the second and third boss, because remember, Solia at the start of the fight does spawn her assassins, and those assassins make it a 3-count target. So up until the point where that disappears, you then have something. And then at the time, I was still bugged to pull things that weren't necessarily in combat with you, pulled the Ritualist and things like that in, then that would have also further augmented it, and we could have benefited from Implosion the entire dungeon. The problem is not every dungeon's like that. So if you are going to play Implosion, Implosion is going to have moments, especially when it comes to bosses, where you're just going to get no benefit from it at all. Now, it is worth saying that if Implosion was to be run, you're going to get a lot of benefit from it in terms of the haste, shard generation, and then further augmenting your imps. Your imps or your carnivorous stalkers. So that is something that you need to consider, because you need to remember that a lot of your damage, like 40% of your damage now, roughly, is going to be coming from imps and dreadstalkers. Because the way our damage works is this is going to be a huge, huge amount of your passive sustain. And in Mythic Plus, that's even more the case when you consider that you are going to be running Dreadlash from the shadows, you're going to be cleaving, you're going to be applying, Shadow Flame debuffs to everything, and then something like Implode, if you are going to run it, is Shadow Flame damage itself. So Implosion's also going to be up there as well. So it's not unheard of, in a couple of the smaller dungeons where I've been practicing since recording this video, I have ended up with almost 60% of my damage being Wild Imps, Implosion, and Dreadstalkers. Then followed up by my Felguard, a couple of bits and pieces, and my Tyrant's actually been really low down. Like, my Tyrant's been like 5-6% of my total damage. Which, when you compare that to previously with Demonic Consumption and our other previous playstyle, where Tyrant has, absolutely slaughtered things. Like, the Mailmaster's a really good example. In previous dungeons, like, prior to the pre-patch, it wasn't unheard of for Demonology Warlocks to come into here. Granted, it was with the haste elemental buffs as well, but for you to be clapping, like, 200k DPS, and the Demo Lock would do 40% of the damage needed for this fight. Because of Tyrant. The loss of Demonic Consumption has really, really hit Warlocks hard. But it's hit Demonology Warlocks in such a way where our damage has kind of shifted. And going back to previous conversations, if you're learning Warlock and you're learning a fight or a dungeon, Demonology is really, really good because we have so many answers to something. We're not reliant on something like Soulflame for Affliction, where you need things to die at different paces in order to get a lot of your damage out, and being able to know how to apply your dots appropriately in order to fully benefit from them, and you're not as reliant on a pull cadence as Destruction is for some of its builds. I say some of its builds because there are a couple of exceptions where you can turn around for Destruction and go, you know what, tank, I don't care what you pull, I'm going to have an answer for everything. Demonology just has that built in. As I say, you don't have to take Implosion if you want to do AoE, but taking Implosion means that you can just snap AoE onto stuff whenever, at the cost of then having to ramp your imps back up afterwards, which is 6 and 2 3s. But one benefit of running the Implosion build would be that if your tank decides, you know what, actually I've pulled 4 targets and I'm actually instead going to go and pull another 4 on top when everything's like at half health, and you've got 12 imps rolling, you can actually go, all right, okay, Dreadstalkers go out, you've now hit all 8 targets with your Dreadstalkers, and then all of a sudden it's just bam, Implosion. And then you can just carry on your rotation normally. Which, you know, it's a satisfying feeling when you can pull that off. For this dungeon though as a whole, one of the things to note specifically related to Street is just how much movement there is. So if I was to play this back, one of the things that I might consider changing is in fact dropping Grimmer Felguard and actually going with Bloodbound Imps. Because this is a dungeon where we've been moving around a lot, and any moment where I've been kind of stood still, I haven't stood still for very long, or I've been holding Grimoire where I haven't needed to. And Bloodbound Imps, for those of you that don't know what it does and haven't really looked on that side of the tree, it increases the rate at which you proc Demonic Core. And the more Demonic Core procs you have, granted there's a very high chance that you can overcap these procs as a result of having Bloodbound Imps, especially if you're imploding. But it means that you can cast while moving, and it further improves our mobility because we're always going to have these charges rolling. Now, placing the gateway, this is going to be something that Warlocks in general are going to need to think about going forward, because obviously taking Demonic Gateway is now a choice. There have been Warlocks I have spoken with and played with that haven't taken this. And this is going to take some awareness for dungeons. It's not needed here, because as you can see, like, we're 4.5 minutes away from like 3 chesting this. So this dungeon's going to be like a comfortable 2 chest. And running round and up the stairs isn't going to be detrimental. It's not like, as a result, we're going to like deplete the key, but it is something that needs to be considered going into Dragonflight, because there's every possibility that you may not have a gateway, or the Warlock in the group might not have a gateway, and the pathing is going to need to be changed. So something to bear in mind, and something that's kind of really well highlighted in this key specifically. Another example of a key would be if it was a workshop. Doing Mechagon Workshop, the very last pack before King Mechagon himself can be skipped, and it's quite common for groups to want to skip that pack because it's a rather nasty pack with multiple hard-hitting adds. You've then got the damage reduction zones that are put down, a couple of infiltrators, and it's just generally not very nice. But you can hard skip it for easier count earlier in the dungeon. So, one of those things. But that's a Warlock general kind of thing to keep in mind. For Demonology itself, there's not too many instances where we need to worry about things as, you know, what talent do we take? Is this talent going to be beneficial or detrimental? Except for when things are dying too quickly. Because again, something, while we're just talking about talents that are detrimental, if we go back 20 seconds, you can see that the icon I'm about to place down, like, we've got everything stacked, and at this point, 70% health. Like, things have got a bit of health left to go. We've got 2 that are, you know, 550k, and then you've got 2 that are over 1 million health, right? So, we go in. I'm now going to Guillotine, so you can see me about to place Guillotine. Guillotine is going to need to be macroed at Macro Cursor, or if you're playing up in a Grundle, and I don't know if this is possible yet, but whether or not you can macro it to your pet, So it's just cast on your pet's location. Something I need to play around with. Either that, or I am just going to have to, like, macro it to 2-player or something and just play in the grundle sometimes. Or really, really close up for you that don't know what I mean by playing in the grundle. Or getting up in someone's grundle. Either which way. But by placing Guillotine down, like, it's pulsing damage, and it's doing, you know, a couple of ticks of 2-3, 5-7. My Felguard's melee hits are coming in with this as well, so you've got a couple of 1-8-3-8s, 5-5-9-6, you know, reasonable amount of damage. But by the time I'd got Guillotine down, we'd already lost 2 of the targets. And, like, Patron is about to die, second one's not far behind it, and then you've got Security as well. And this kind of almost pushes us to the idea that Demonology, or Warlock in general, is kind of going to have the Elemental Shaman problem going forward. If you have a group that is going to be really bursty, like Teddy, playing his Survival Hunter at the moment, can do an incredible amount of burst. And in doing so, kind of reduces how much time we have to get things out and get things actually, like, get the ball rolling, essentially. Because a lot of Demonology is about having something rolling. Whether it be having imps to implode, your Dreadstalkers out, you know, Guillotines back up. But Guillotine takes time to do all its damage. It's not like a one instant hit, because it's a pulsating AoE. And the other part of Guillotine's damage is your Felguard is punching things faster, and that AoE cleaves. So, you know, we need to take these things into consideration when we're putting out abilities, which means that it's very, very likely that for Dragonflight itself and where Demonology sits, we're going to end up in a position where Warlock's early, like, low tier dungeons, maybe like your 1 through to 10 region-ish, might not look all that impressive in terms of the damage done, because everything's dying too fast. And this is like early doors, so when people aren't particularly geared and are pushing keys, we might still get to 10s and be like, okay, Warlocks aren't great, like, the damage isn't impressive. Like, at the moment I'm doing 16k DPS. Granted, some of this is me just not managing Demo well, because remember, the time I'm recording this, it was like 2 days into the pre-patch. Kind of messing around, getting everything done, and trying to record all this stuff for you so I can get other videos out. But at the same time, trying to do a 17 with a full team that's geared, because both Teddy, Zero, and myself are all, you know, 300 item level plus, and we're doing a 17. Tyrannical, which means that the trash just folds. And that is going to impact how much ramp time I have, which feels really weird to say when you consider that Demonology might actually be more ramp reliant than Affliction is. That really feels weird to say, even though I know it to be true. And this is partially due to that ramping playstyle, I say, that Implosion naturally brings with it, and also that Demonology having something always rolling kind of needs, like, because you're having everything rolling, you need that moment to get yourself going. You need to get the momentum flowing, and once it's flowing, then you're good to go for anything. So Penny, our tank, who used to be a former Warlock, has a really nice pull cadence, does a really good job of pulling the dungeon, and it's a fast dungeon. Problem is, Streets itself, there are moments where you can pull as fast as you like. You're going to have moments of downtime, and unfortunately for Demonology, during those moments of downtime is when my imps are dying. So a dungeon, if we were to change the dungeon again, to use Gambit as a really good example, there's not many moments of downtime when it comes to your trash. The main moments of downtime is after first boss and after second boss. After those 2 moments when you're transitioning through the portals, everything else can kind of be chained onto each other at a really fast pace. And in a dungeon like that, Demonology is going to get more benefit from it, because I'm always going to have my imps, they're not going to be dying, and there's not much time between pack to pack to pack. And it's those speedy transitions between dungeons or dungeon packs that is going to further help Demonology, especially when you further add on to the changes that have recently come in terms of how much damage we can do. Now, I appreciate this video is getting quite long. We've broken the 30-minute mark. So what we'll do is we will bench the variant discussion with the imp changes and things like that. And if you guys comment below, let me know how you want me to demonstrate the variant build and what, like, how much of an in-depth discussion you want around it. And also let me know if you like this video as it is with a discussion about Demonology while watching me clear the 17 streets. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Take care.